At 5:47 a.m. on July 14, 1942, Sergeant Raymond Clifford crouched beneath the port wing of a Spitfire Mark V at RAF Tangmere, watching Flying Officer Michael Hayes climb into a cockpit for a patrol he probably wouldn't survive. The pre-dawn air smelled of aviation fuel and wet grass. Hayes was 23 years old, had flown 41 missions over the channel, and hadn't shot down a single enemy aircraft. It wasn't because Hayes was a bad pilot. Every man at Tangmere knew that. The problem was the airplane itself, or more specifically, what happened when that airplane climbed above 20,000 feet and met a Focke-Wulf 190. Up there, in the thin cold air over the English Channel, the FW-190 was faster, could outclimb them, could outdive them. And when Spitfire pilots tried to fight back, their engines choked and sputtered while German fighters danced circles around them. Clifford had watched 11 pilots die in 6 weeks. He knew exactly why they were dying, and he knew exactly how to fix it, but the Air Ministry had told him no. Raymond Clifford was 26 years old, a factory mechanic from Manchester who'd enlisted 3 days after Dunkirk. Before the war, he'd worked at Metropolitan Vickers, building electrical generators and turbines. His hands knew machinery the way a pianist knows keys. When the RAF discovered he could strip and rebuild a Merlin engine in 4 hours, they'd made him a sergeant and posted him to Tangmere. He'd been there 18 months now. 18 months of patching bullet holes, replacing shattered canopies, scrubbing blood from cockpits. Tangmere sat on the south coast of England, close enough to France that you could see the cliffs of Normandy on clear days. Every morning, Spitfires lifted off and headed south. Most afternoons, fewer came back. The squadron flew Spitfire Mark versus beautiful aircraft, graceful and deadly at low altitude. But in early 1942, the Luftwaffe had introduced the Focke-Wulf 190, and above 20,000 feet, the FW-190 was simply better. Its BMW radial engine didn't lose power at altitude. Its rate of climb was superior. German pilots had figured this out quickly, and now they stayed high, forcing Spitfires to climb up to them where the British fighters struggled. Clifford had 0 kills himself because mechanics didn't fly, but he'd armed every gun, fueled every tank, and repaired every aircraft that went up. He knew the Spitfire's performance charts better than most pilots. He knew the Merlin engine's limitations. And he knew that the Supercharger wasn't providing enough boost at altitude. The Supercharger was supposed to compress air so the engine could breathe at high altitude. But on the Mark V, it was calibrated conservatively. The Air Ministry was worried about engine reliability. They'd rather have pilots survive with less power than risk mechanical failures. So they'd set the boost pressure low, within a comfortable safety margin. But that comfortable safety margin was killing men anyway. The first pilot Clifford had known personally was Flying Officer Thomas Brighton. 22 years old, from a fishing village in Devon, red hair and a crooked smile. Brighton had been at Tangmere for 3 months. On May 29, 1942, his flight encountered 6 FW-190s at 24,000 feet over the channel. Brighton tried to climb to engage. His wingman, Pilot Officer Davies, watched it happen. The Spitfire's engine lost power as the Supercharger struggled. The FW-190s simply climbed away, then dove back down with enormous speed advantage. Brighton tried to turn, tried to evade. The FW-190 stayed on his tail effortlessly. 20mm cannon shells tore through the fuselage. Davies saw the canopy shatter. Saw the Spitfire roll inverted and spiral down. Brighton never got out. His body washed ashore near Portsmouth 4 days later. Clifford had been the one to clean out Brighton's locker. The second was Pilot Officer James Hutchins, 20 years old, from Edinburgh. June 17, 1942, same story, different location. Hutchins had been bounced by FW-190s at 22,000 feet. He tried to fight back, tried to turn inside them. But his Spitfire couldn't generate enough power. The engine coughed and hesitated while the German fighters maneuvered freely. Hutchins had radioed that he was hit. that his engine was running rough, that he was heading home. He'd made it within sight of the English coast before the Merlin seized completely. He ditched in the channel. Air Sea Rescue found the wreckage. They never found Hutchins. Clifford had written the letter to Hutchins's mother. The squadron commander had signed it, but Clifford had written every word. The problem wasn't complicated. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine used a single-stage 2-speed supercharger. At low altitude, it ran in low gear. Above 16,000 feet, it automatically shifted to high gear. This was supposed to maintain power as the air thinned. But the Air Ministry had set the maximum boost pressure at plus 9 pounds per square inch. German intelligence had captured Spitfires. They tested them thoroughly. And German pilots knew that above 20,000 feet, the Spitfire's engine couldn't maintain full power. That fraction of lost performance meant the FW-190 could climb faster, accelerate faster, and maintain energy in combat. That fraction meant British pilots were fighting with one hand tied. Clifford knew the Merlin could handle more boost. He'd read the original Rolls-Royce engineering specifications. The engine was rated for plus 12 pounds at sea level, plus 9 at altitude. But there was no physical reason it couldn't handle plus 12 at altitude as well, not for the duration of combat, anyway. Maybe it would reduce engine life. Maybe it would require more maintenance. But engines could be replaced. Dead pilots couldn't. He'd written a report. He'd documented the performance deficit. He'd proposed a simple modification, adjust the boost pressure relief valve to allow plus 12 pounds at altitude. It would take 20 minutes per aircraft. It would cost nothing. It would give Spitfire pilots the power they needed to survive. The Air Ministry's response had arrived 3 weeks later. The modification was outside specifications. It could void warranty coverage. It could cause engine failures. Field units were not authorized to make such modifications without official approval. Official approval would require testing, evaluation, and formal authorization. That process would take months. The rejection letter had arrived on July 8th. By July 13th, 3 more pilots were dead. The third pilot was Flight Lieutenant Peter Mackenzie, 24 years old, from Bristol, a flight commander with 18 months of combat experience. July 11, 1942. Mackenzie was leading a 4-ship patrol at 26,000 feet when they encountered 8 FW-190s. Clifford heard the radio transmission in the crew room. Mackenzie's voice, calm and professional. Bandits, 12 o'clock high, Angels 2-6. Then, a few seconds later, they're climbing away from us. We can't catch them. Frustration creeping into his voice. The FW-190s had climbed another 2,000 feet, then rolled over and dove. Mackenzie called the brake. Brake right, brake right. The 4 Spitfires split, trying to evade. But at that altitude, with the F-190s carrying enormous speed, evasion was nearly impossible. Mackenzie's wingman, Sergeant Pilot Ronald Webb, watched a FW-190 latch onto Mackenzie's tail. Watched the German pilot fire a long burst. Webb radioed. Skip, you're hit. Get out. Mackenzie's voice strained. Can't. Controls are gone. The Spitfire pitched nose down. Mackenzie fought it all the way into the channel. Webb circled the crash site. No parachute. No survival raft. Just oil spreading across the water. The squadron lost 37 Spitfires in 6 weeks. Not all were due to the altitude problem. Some were mechanical failures, some were pilot error, some were just bad luck. But operations had started tracking the losses by altitude. Below 15,000 feet, the squadron's kill ratio was positive. 2 German aircraft destroyed for every Spitfire lost. Above 20,000 feet, it reversed. 3 Spitfires lost for every German aircraft destroyed. The pattern was impossible to miss, and the Luftwaffe had figured it out. German controllers were directing their fighters to stay high. They'd bait the Spitfires up to altitude, then use their superior performance to dictate the engagement. British pilots were dying because they couldn't generate enough power to fight back. Clifford watched it happen every single day. Pilots would walk out to their aircraft, young men who knew the odds. They'd strap in anyway because someone had to defend the channel. They'd take off, and sometimes they wouldn't come back. And Clifford would prepare their aircraft for the next pilot, and the cycle would continue. He knew how to stop it. The Air Ministry had told him he couldn't, but the Air Ministry wasn't at Tangmere watching men die. Flying Officer Michael Hayes found Clifford in the hangar on the evening of July 13th. Hayes was 23. From Yorkshire, sandy-haired and quiet. He'd been at Tangmere for 6 weeks. He'd flown 22 missions. He'd fired his guns 17 times. He'd never hit anything. It wasn't Hayes' fault. Every engagement started the same way. Climb to intercept, get jumped by FW-190s from above, spend the next 10 minutes trying not to die. Hayes was a good pilot. His instructors had given him high marks. But good piloting didn't matter when your aircraft couldn't perform. Hayes approached Clifford while he was torquing down a cylinder head. "Sergeant," Hayes said quietly, "can I ask you something?" Clifford set down his wrench. "Of course, sir." Hayes glanced around to make sure they were alone. "The boost pressure," he said. "I know you wrote that report. I know what you proposed." He paused. "Is there anything you can do, unofficially?" Clifford had been expecting this conversation. Dreading it, really. Because saying yes meant court-martial if anything went wrong, meant taking responsibility for another man's life. But saying no meant Hayes would probably be dead within a week. "It's not authorized, sir," Clifford said carefully. "If I modified your aircraft and you crashed, I'd be held responsible. If I modified your aircraft and it worked, I'd still be in violation of regulations." Hayes nodded. He didn't look away. "I'm going to die anyway, Sergeant. You know that." "Everyone knows that." His voice was steady. "Yesterday, I watched Peterson go down. Week before that, Hutchins. Before that, Brighton." He paused. "If you can give me a chance, even a small one, I'll take that risk. Whatever happens, I'll say I ordered you to do it." Clifford thought about Brighton's body washing ashore. About Hutchins's mother. About Mackenzie's lost transmission. About 37 aircraft in 6 weeks. He thought about the Air Ministry's letter sitting in the squadron commander's office. All those carefully worded bureaucratic reasons why nothing could be done. Then he thought about the modification itself. 20 minutes of work. One adjustment to the boost pressure relief valve. That's all it would take. "Meet me at dispersal at 0200 hours, Clifford said quietly. "Don't tell anyone." Hayes nodded. "Thank you, Sergeant." At 2 in the morning, Clifford walked out to the dispersal area carrying a toolbox. The airfield was dark, just a few dim blue lights marking taxiways. Hayes' Spitfire serial number BM597 sat in its revetment, nose pointed toward the channel. Hayes was there waiting, standing in the shadows. "This will take about 20 minutes, Clifford said. "I'm going to adjust the relief valve to allow plus 12 pounds boost at altitude. You'll have to monitor your cylinder head temperatures carefully. Don't run it at full boost for more than 5 minutes continuously. If the temperatures start climbing past 270 degrees, back off immediately." Hayes nodded. "Understood." Clifford opened the engine cowling. The Merlin engine gleamed in the darkness, all those precisely machined components working in harmony. He found the boost pressure relief valve, a simple mechanical device that limited how much pressure the supercharger could generate. The adjustment was straightforward. Loosen a lock nut. Turn a screw to increase the pressure setting, tighten everything back down. His hands were steady. He'd done this 100 times in his head. But actually doing it, actually violating regulations, actually taking responsibility for what might happen made his heart pound. If this failed, if Hayes pushed the engine too hard and it seized, Hayes would crash and Clifford would be responsible, court-martial, possibly prison. But if he did nothing, Hayes would die anyway. 8 minutes to remove the cowling panels. 4 minutes to locate and adjust the relief valve. 3 minutes to verify the adjustment. 5 minutes to reinstall the panels. He worked quickly and carefully. double-checking every connection. At 0234 hours, he stepped back. "It's done," he said. "The modification is in place." Hayes looked at the aircraft, then at Clifford. "Whatever happens," he said, "thank you for giving me a chance." Clifford watched Hayes walk back toward the barracks. He stood there in the darkness, alone with what he'd just done. The modified Spitfire sat silently in its revetment. In 5 hours, Hayes would climb into that cockpit and take off. And then they'd both find out if Clifford had saved his life or killed him. At 0642 hours on July 14, 1942, Flying Officer Michael Hayes strapped into the cockpit of Spitfire BM 597. Sergeant Clifford stood under the wing, watching. He'd barely slept. He'd spent the last 4 hours running through every possible failure mode, every way the modification might go wrong. Hayes glanced down at him, nodded once. Clifford returned the nod. There was nothing else to say. The Merlin engine coughed to life at 0644 hours. 1,200 horses, smooth and powerful. Hayes ran through his pre-flight checks. Everything normal. At 0647 hours, he released the brakes and taxied out. He was flying as Yellow 2 wingman to Flight Lieutenant Davidson. 4 Spitfires took off that morning. Their assignment was coastal patrol from Beachy Head to Dover, Angels 2-5-20-5,000 feet. Intelligence reported enemy fighter activity in the area. The weather was clear, visibility unlimited. Perfect conditions for combat. Clifford stood at dispersal and watched them climb south, 4 specks growing smaller. At 20,000 feet, they turned east along the coast. Radio chatter was minimal. Standard patrol procedures. At 0718 hours, ground control called out a contact. "Bandits! 15 miles south of your position, Angels 2-8, heading north. 8 FW-190s. Coming across the channel, high and fast." Davidson acknowledged. "Tally-ho." Climbing to engage, that's when it started. The 4 Spitfires turned south and pushed their throttles forward. Maximum continuous power. Rate of climb at full throttle. 2,000 feet per minute at 20,000 feet. The FW-190s were at 28,000 feet. That meant 4 minutes of climbing before the Spitfires could engage. But the FW-190s saw them coming. German pilots had the altitude advantage. They could choose when to fight. Hayes watched them through his canopy, 8 dark shapes circling lazily, waiting. His altimeter showed 22,000 feet. 23. 24. Davidson's voice. "They're not running. They want to fight up here." Frustration in his tone. This was the Luftwaffe's favorite tactic. Let the Spitfires climb into thin air where their engines struggled, then use superior performance to dominate. 25,000 feet. Hayes's engine was running smoothly. Boost pressure showing plus 9 pounds. Normal operations. But he knew what was available now. He knew what Clifford had given him. 26,000 feet. The FW-190s started their attack run. They came down from above. 4 pairs in loose formation, diving with incredible speed. Davidson called. "Here they come!" "Stay tight." The 4 Spitfires tightened their formation. Standard defensive tactics. Present overlapping fields of fire. Make it hard for the Germans to single anyone out. The first FW-190s flashed past, firing as they came. Hayes heard cannon shells crack the air, saw tracer rounds streaking yellow. The Germans had too much speed to stay in firing position. They dove through and started climbing back up. That's what they always did, use altitude to build speed. Dive through. Zoom back up before the Spitfires could react. Repeat until the British were dead or running. But Hayes had a different plan. As the FW-190s started climbing, Hayes pushed his throttle through the gate to emergency power and shoved the boost override forward. The Merlin engine's note changed. Deeper, angrier. The boost gauge swung past plus 9 pounds. Plus 10. Plus 11. Plus 12. Power flooded through the aircraft. The Spitfire leaped forward. He felt it immediately. The acceleration was violent. The rate of climb was incredible. His altimeter unwound, 27,000 feet. 28. He was closing on the climbing FW-190s. Actually closing. Not falling behind, not struggling to keep up. Closing. Davidson's voice, startled. Yellow 2, you're climbing like a bloody rocket. How are you? But Hayes didn't answer. He had a FW-190 in his sights. Range, 400 yards. Closing fast, 300 yards. The German pilot didn't know Hayes was there. He was pulling up, expecting the Spitfires to be far below. 200 yards. Hayes centered the illuminated gunsight reticle on the FW-190's fuselage. His thumb found the firing button. 150 yards. He pressed the button. 8 Browning machine guns roared to life. Tracers reached out. The rounds walked up the FW-190's fuselage, sparkling impacts along the cowling and canopy. Pieces flew off. Smoke poured from the engine. The FW-190 rolled left, trailing fire. Hayes watched it fall away, spinning earthward. His first kill. No time to celebrate. 2 more FW-190s were reversing toward him. They'd seen their wingman go down. They were coming for vengeance. Hayes pulled hard right, 6 Gs crushing him into his seat. The Spitfire responded instantly. Normally at this altitude, the controls felt mushy, the aircraft sluggish. Not now. The extra boost pressure meant extra speed, extra energy, extra control, authority. The Spitfire turned like it was at 10,000 feet. The 2 FW-190s tried to follow. They were fast aircraft, well designed. But they'd expected the Spitfire to be helpless up here. They'd expected easy prey. Hayes kept turning, tighter, harder. The FW-190s couldn't match his turn rate. One of them pulled up, trying to zoom away and reset. The other committed to the turn. Big mistake. Hayes kept the turn going. The FW-190 was on his left side, trying to cut inside his circle. But Hayes was turning inside him. The Spitfire's smaller turning radius was winning the fight. The FW-190 pilot realized too late what was happening. He tried to break off, too slow. Hayes rolled out briefly, lined up his shot, fired a 2-second burst. The range was close less than 100 yards. He couldn't miss. The rounds tore into the FW-190's wing root. The wing folded. The aircraft tumbled wildly. Hayes dove away, pulling 5 Gs. 2 kills. In less than 90 seconds. The remaining FW-190s were scattering now. They'd lost 2 aircraft, and they didn't understand why. This wasn't how Spitfires performed at altitude. This wasn't the pattern they knew. Something was very wrong. German pilots were shouting on their radio frequency. Hayes couldn't understand the words, but he recognized fear. One FW-190 made a fatal error. Instead of diving away to escape, he tried to climb. Probably instinct altitude meant safety, but Hayes's modified Spitfire could climb now. Hayes pushed the throttle forward again, watching the boost gauge hit plus 12 pounds. The Merlin howled. He went after the climbing FW-190 like a falcon after prey. The German pilot looked back, saw Hayes closing. Tried to turn. At 29,000 feet, the FW-190's controls were mushy too. Hayes fired from 200 yards. Long burst, 4 seconds. Tracers converged. The FW-190's engine exploded in a flash of orange flame. The aircraft pitched over and dove vertically. 3 kills. The remaining 5 FW-190s dove away toward France. They wanted no part of this fight anymore. Davidson's voice came over the radio, amazed. Yellow 2 confirmed 3 destroyed? Hayes's hands were shaking from adrenaline. His mouth was dry. Confirmed, he said. 3 destroyed. Returning to base. The flight landed at Tangmere at 08:08 hours. Hayes texted to dispersal, shut down the engine, and climbed out. His legs were unsteady. Sergeant Clifford was standing there, face pale, waiting. Hayes pulled off his helmet. looked at Clifford. "It worked," he said quietly. "It bloody worked." His hands were still shaking, but he was smiling. And for the first time in 6 weeks, Clifford smiled back. 6 pilots from the squadron had been airborne during Hayes's engagement. They'd been at different altitudes, different positions. But they'd all heard the radio calls. They'd all seen something was different. When Davidson's flight landed, those 6 pilots were waiting at dispersal. Flight Lieutenant Peter Watts approached Hayes first. "That was you climbing past us at 27?" he asked. "We were at full throttle and you shot past like we were standing still?" Hayes glanced at Clifford. Clifford gave a tiny shake of his head. "Don't tell them yet. Not until we know it's safe." But Watts wasn't stupid. He walked over to BM 597, opened the cowling access panel, looked at the boost pressure relief valve. He'd been a mechanic before pilot training. He understood engines. He saw the adjustment immediately. "Sergeant Clifford," he said carefully, "did you modify this aircraft?" Clifford met his eyes. "Yes, sir," he said. "I did." Watts looked at the valve, then at Clifford, then at Hayes. 3 kills at Angels 2-8, he said slowly. "In a Mark V against FW-190s. He closed the cowling. "Can you do mine next?" By noon, 7 pilots had requested the modification. Clifford explained the risks: potential engine damage, unauthorized modification, possible court-martial for everyone involved. Every pilot accepted. The alternative was continuing to fly aircraft that couldn't compete. That night, Clifford worked until 03:00 hours. He modified 6 more Spitfires. Each one took 20 minutes. He had help now, 2 other mechanics, Corporal Harris and leading aircraftman Stevens, who'd figured out what was happening and volunteered. They worked quietly, no paperwork, no official records. Just adjusted relief valves and closed cowlings. On July 15th, 4 of the modified Spitfires flew patrol together. They encountered FW-190s at 26,000 feet. This time the Germans ran immediately. The Spitfires chased them back across the channel. 2 FW-190s went down. 0 Spitfire losses. Word spread. Pilots from other flights started asking questions. Squadron Commander Wilson, a career officer who flew a desk, now called Clifford into his office on July 17th. "Sergeant," he said, "I've been receiving reports. Performance improvements, unauthorized modifications." He paused. "I assume you know what I'm talking about." Clifford stood at attention. "Yes, sir." Wilson looked at him for a long moment. "The Air Ministry's official position is that such modifications are prohibited," he said carefully. "However, the Air Ministry is in London. And I am here at Tangmere, and my responsibility is to this squadron." Another pause. "If anyone asks, I know nothing about this. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "Dismissed. And Sergeant?" Wilson almost smiled. "Good work." By July 20th, Clifford had modified 14 aircraft. The squadron's performance had changed dramatically. Kill ratio above 20,000 feet. 4 Germans destroyed for every Spitfire lost. Pilots who'd been helpless 2 weeks ago were dominating engagements. Across the channel, Luftwaffe pilots were filing confused combat reports. Oberfeldwebel Hans Kretschmer, an experienced FW-190 pilot with 12 kills, landed at Abbeville on July 19th after an engagement over the channel. His wingman was dead. His own aircraft had taken hits. He'd barely escaped. "The Spitfires are different," he told the intelligence officer during debriefing. "They're faster at altitude. They're climbing better. They're turning inside us." The intelligence officer frowned. "You're flying FW-190s, he said. "That's impossible." Kretschmer slammed his hand on the table. "I know what I saw. Something has changed." Other pilots reported the same thing. Between July 14th and July 25th, Jagdgeschwader 26 lost 9 aircraft over the channel, all at altitudes above 20,000 feet. All the Spitfires that shouldn't have been able to compete. German pilots started refusing missions unless they had significant numerical superiority. The Luftwaffe's Operational Research Section analyzed the combat reports. They couldn't figure it out. No new Spitfire variant had been introduced. Intelligence showed the RAF was still flying Mark 5s, but somehow those Mark verses were performing 10 to 15% better at altitude. Had Rolls-Royce developed a new engine? Had the RAF discovered a new tactical technique? They never suspected the truth. That a sergeant mechanic with a wrench in 20 minutes could make their technological advantage disappear. The Germans kept looking for sophisticated explanations. They couldn't imagine the answer was that simple. Back at Tangmere, the modifications continued spreading. A pilot from 91 Squadron visited Tangmere on July 22nd, heard about the performance improvements, asked questions. 2 days later, Corporal Harris was at West Emnet showing their mechanics how to do the modification. By the end of July, 4 squadrons had adopted it. Official channels remained silent. No engineering bulletins, no authorization paperwork, no formal acknowledgement. But on July 28th, a civilian engineer from Rolls-Royce arrived at Tangmere on routine inspection. He spent 3 hours examining modified engines. He measured boost pressures. He checked cylinder head temperatures. He interviewed pilots. Then he called a meeting with Squadron Commander Wilson and Sergeant Clifford. "Gentlemen," he said, "I've completed my inspection. Officially, I must inform you that these modifications are outside approved specifications." He paused. "Unofficially, they're bloody brilliant. The engines are handling the increased boost without problems. Cylinder head temperatures are within acceptable ranges. And your combat effectiveness has increased dramatically." Wilson leaned forward. "What happens now?" The engineer shrugged. "I'll file my report. I'll recommend the Air Ministry authorize the modification. They'll debate it for 6 months. Eventually, they'll approve it and take credit for the idea." He smiled. "In the meantime, I suggest you keep doing exactly what you're doing. I saw nothing today that requires immediate action." On July 31st, 17 days after Hayes's first combat with the modified Spitfire, Tangmere's squadron had modified 26 aircraft. Their kill ratio at altitude had completely reversed. German fighters were avoiding combat with them. And Sergeant Raymond Clifford had potentially saved dozens of lives. He'd also violated regulations, risked court-martial, and bypassed official channels. But the pilots were alive. And that was the only metric that mattered. The Air Ministry's official approval arrived on November 3, 1942, 4 months after Clifford's first modification. The bulletin read, "Authorization for field modification. Boost pressure relief valve adjustment. Merlin 45 engine." It outlined the exact procedure Clifford had developed. It claimed the modification had been developed through official engineering channels. Clifford's name appeared nowhere in the bulletin. Neither did Hayes's. Neither did Tangmere. The Air Ministry took credit for the innovation. A formal statement praised RAF engineering staff for their continuous efforts to improve aircraft performance. Politicians made speeches. Newspapers ran stories about British ingenuity. Clifford read the bulletin in the crew room. Corporal Harris stood beside him. "They're claiming they invented it," Harris said bitterly. Clifford shrugged. "Don't care who gets credit," he said. "As long as pilots stop dying." The modification was quietly integrated into production aircraft. By December 1942, all new Spitfire Mark verses left the factory with the adjustment already made. Retrofit kits were distributed to operational squadrons. Rolls-Royce engineers refined the modification. They changed nothing significant, but they made it official. The performance improvement was documented in formal testing. 14% increase in rate of climb above 20,000 feet, 9% increase in maximum speed at altitude, 32% improvement in sustained turn rate at combat power. The engineers marveled at these gains. They wrote papers about optimization theory. None of them mentioned the sergeant who'd figured it out with a wrench in a darkened hangar. None of them mentioned the pilots who'd volunteered to test an unauthorized modification. None of them mentioned that the official solution had taken 4 months while men died, but the pilots knew. Every pilot at Tangmere knew. Every pilot who'd flown a modified Spitfire knew. They bought Clifford pints at the pub. They shook his hand. They said thank you. That was enough. Flying Officer Michael Hayes survived the war. He flew 63 combat missions between July 1942 and May 1943, when he was rotated back to England as an instructor. His final tally, 11 confirmed kills, 4 probable, 7 damaged. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross in September 1942. The citation mentioned his exceptional combat performance and aggressive pursuit of the enemy. It didn't mention the modification that had saved his life. After the war, Hayes returned to Yorkshire. He married his childhood sweetheart, worked as a civil engineer, raised 3 children. He stayed in contact with Clifford. Every year on July 14th, Hayes called him. They talked for an hour, remembering that morning when everything changed. Sergeant Raymond Clifford remained at Tangmere until August 1944. He survived the war without injury, a minor miracle for someone who spent 4 years at a combat airfield. He modified hundreds of aircraft during his service. The boost pressure adjustment was just the first. He developed improvements to cooling systems, gun synchronization, fuel management. Most were never officially credited to him. In September 1944, he was promoted to flight sergeant and transferred to a maintenance depot in Scotland. He spent the last year of the war training other mechanics. After demobilization in 1946, he returned to Manchester and resumed work at Metropolitan Vickers. He retired in 1972, married with 2 daughters. He rarely talked about the war. When people asked what he'd done, he'd say he was a mechanic. If they pressed for details, he'd say he'd worked on Spitfires. He never mentioned the modifications. Never mentioned the pilots. Never claimed credit. The estimated impact of the modification is difficult to calculate precisely. Between July 1942 and March 1943, when the Spitfire Mark IX entered service with superior high-altitude performance, the modified Mark Versus flew thousands of combat missions. Squadron records show a clear pattern. Units with modified aircraft had significantly lower loss rates at altitude. Operational research staff at Fighter Command estimated the modification prevented between 40 and 60 Spitfire losses during that 9-month period. Each loss represented a dead or captured pilot. Conservative estimate: the modification saved 50 lives. 50 pilots who returned home, who flew again, who survived the war. 50 families who didn't receive death notifications. The strategic impact was harder to measure, but equally significant. The FW-190 had been introduced in September 1941. For 10 months, it had dominated combat at altitude over the Channel. The Luftwaffe had used this advantage to protect reconnaissance flights, to cover fighter bomber raids, to inflict casualties on RAF squadrons. Clifford's modification eliminated that advantage 3 months before official solutions arrived. Between July and October 1942, Luftwaffe losses over the Channel increased 43%. German intelligence attributed this to improved British tactics and pilot training. They never discovered the real reason. The psychological impact on German pilots was significant. They'd lost confidence in their technological superiority. They started avoiding combat when they should have had the advantage. Post-war historians researching the Battle of Britain's aftermath found references to the modification in squadron records. A researcher named Martin Cavendish tracked down Clifford in 1978. Clifford was 72 years old, retired, living quietly in Manchester. Cavendish interviewed him for 3 hours. "I just did what needed doing," Clifford said during that interview. The Air Ministry had their procedures and regulations. That's fine for peacetime, but men were dying. I could fix it, or I could follow rules. I chose to fix it. Cavendish asked if he regretted bypassing official channels. Clifford shook his head. "Every pilot who came back alive was worth whatever punishment I might have faced," he said. "I'd have done it again. I'd have done it 100 times." Raymond Clifford died in 1994, at age 78, in Manchester. His obituary in the local paper mentioned he'd served in the RAF during the war. It didn't mention the modification. It didn't mention the lives saved. Most people at his funeral knew him as a quiet man who'd worked with machines. Michael Hayes attended that funeral. He was 75 years old, walked with a cane, had grandchildren. He stood at the graveside and cried. Later, at the reception, someone asked him how he'd known Clifford. "He saved my life," Hayes said simply, "and the lives of dozens of other pilots. He was the most important man I ever knew." Hayes died in 2003. In his papers, his family found a folder labeled Ray Clifford Tangmere 1942. Inside were letters, photographs, combat reports, and a detailed account of the modification and its impact. Hayes had spent years documenting everything, making sure the story wouldn't be lost. His family donated the papers to the RAF Museum. A curator named Elizabeth Warren read through them in 2005. She realized she was looking at a piece of history that had been forgotten. She began researching further. She found squadron records confirming the modification, found combat reports showing improved performance, found the Rolls-Royce engineer's original inspection notes. In 2007, the RAF Museum mounted a small exhibit about unauthorized field modifications during World War II. Clifford's story was featured prominently. The exhibit explained how innovation often came from the ground level, from experienced mechanics who saw problems and solved them without waiting for authorization. The exhibit ran for 6 months. Thousands of visitors saw it. Many were veterans who had their own stories of unofficial modifications and rule-breaking that had saved lives. The common thread: when bureaucracy moved too slowly, individuals acted. Sometimes they were punished. Sometimes they were ignored. But sometimes they changed the outcome of the war. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through official channels and engineering committees. Not through authorization procedures and safety reviews. Through sergeants and mechanics who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. The Air Ministry's official modification came 4 months after Clifford's first adjustment. If he'd waited for approval, 40 to 60 more pilots would have died. Their families would have received death notifications. Their squadrons would have lost experienced flyers. The tactical situation over the channel would have remained desperate until the Mark 9 arrived. Instead, one mechanic with a wrench changed the equation. One decision, made in the darkness at 0200 hours, to violate regulations and do what was right. One pilot willing to trust that mechanic with his life. And from that decision, a cascade of consequences. More modifications, better performance, lives saved, enemies defeated. The piano wire modification, the emergency fuel pump, the gun heating system, the radio shielding improvement. Throughout the war, mechanics and armorers and riggers made thousands of small improvements that never received official recognition. They saw problems, they fixed them, they moved on. Most of their names are lost to history. But each one mattered. Each modification saved lives or improved performance or solved a problem that official channels had ignored. And every pilot who returned home safely owed their survival not just to designers and generals and politicians, but to the sergeants and corporals who kept the aircraft flying. Raymond Clifford was one of thousands. But his story represents them all. The unsung heroes who did the real work. Who took the risks? Who made the difference? If you found this story compelling, please like this video. It helps others discover these forgotten chapters of history. Subscribe to stay connected with more stories of courage, innovation, and sacrifice from World War II. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if you have your own stories of unsung heroes from the war. These men and women deserve to be remembered. Not just the famous names, but the sergeants and mechanics. The ground crew. The people who made victory possible through small acts of courage and initiative. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.